Welcome to Building Programs, Building Brains, Diversity and English Language Development for Grades Kindergarten to 8. This training was developed by BOSNet in partnership with UMass Boston, with funding from the Massachusetts Department of Early Education and Care, and brain building is in progress. At any time, you can hover over any of these logos to learn more. This is the first interactive presentation, Exploring Diversity and English Language Development. When you hear the word diversity, what's the first thing you think of? For most people, the first thing they think of is diversity across different races or ethnicities. Some people think about diversity across gender or age. Some people think about language of origin. And some people think about disability. But these are not the only diversity factors. As you work through this course, I'm going to encourage you to think as broadly as possible about diversity, to really open your mind to the idea that diversity is more than just the first few things that pop into your mind. So there are so many different elements. They're popping up as we speak on the slide, all these different elements like employment status and the country of origin of the person or of their family or even of their ancestors, the socioeconomic status or income level of the person and their families, a mental health history or background, even things like values, attitudes about fighting, the family model or family structure, any kind of background or history in court. There are all these different elements, and if you take a few minutes, I'm sure you can brainstorm half a dozen that aren't even on this slide. And the reason that we're asking you to think about this is to remember that a person's identity is made up of tens or dozens or maybe even hundreds of different elements or factors like this, and how each person relates to each of these different factors is unique. So one person's identity is made up of unique relationships with a broad array of unique diversity factors, which leads us to the inescapable conclusion that every person is unique. This is a concept that is deceptively complicated. To explain, it seems very simple. To think about on a surface level, it seems very simple. But to embrace the idea that each person you look at and each person you talk to is a unique and complicated combination of so many different factors of their identity, and for each of those factors, each person forms a different relationship to that factor. For instance, my relationship to my gender as a woman may be very different than another person's relationship to their gender, even though they are also a woman. And that's going to be true with each and every one of my diversity factors. So with that in mind, how would you define diversity? What would be a definition that worked for you and that encompassed all of these complicated concepts? I'll give you a minute to think about that. In this course, we're going to be focusing on English Language Development, or ELD, and English Language Learners, or ELL. It's very valuable to remember that just because a child needs support in their development of English language skills doesn't necessarily mean that they are a non-native speaker of English or that English was not their first language or their home language. It may not even necessarily mean that the child is in a multilingual household. Some children whose only language is English still struggle with English language development. So while we'll be talking a lot about English language learners or children from homes with other languages aside from English, do remember that not all children who need help with English language development are English language learners. English language development, or ELD, is the process by which English language skills and competencies are developed or attained. So ELD, or English language development, The process over time has changed. It used to be that the best thinking in the subject was that children should be immersed in an all-English environment and they would figure it out, they would absorb it naturally. Sometimes there were sort of supplemental or additional language classes, usually also as a full immersion, so the classes being taught only in English. And this was a sort of sink or swim model, and a lot of kids were not successful with this model. So over time, a lot of research and exploration has been dedicated to figuring out more about how language skills are actually developed. And our understanding and our knowledge has really evolved over time, and that's a wonderful thing. English language learners, or ELL, one of the things that is most important to remember about this population of children is that every child is going to be at a different level than every other child. So it's not safe to assume that you can group all of the kids in your program who are learners of English into a category and give them all the exact same support, because different kids will need different supports. It's also important to remember that different home languages or languages of origin sometimes pose different types of challenge. For instance, a language where the written language is characters like Japanese or Chinese, or even where there isn't really much of a written language, learning to read and write is going to be more of a challenge. Similarly, in a language where the writing is backwards, like Hebrew, or top to bottom, like Chinese, learning to read from right to left may be more of a challenge. It's also very, very valuable to remember that language skills are not uniform across different subjects or different environments. So a child might be far more comfortable and competent with their English skills when playing with peers, and much less comfortable when trying to do math or science. Or vice versa, a child might be much more comfortable with certain more academic language and less comfortable with more social language. Remember, too, that we tend to have misconceptions and assumptions in our minds about students who are learners of English. We tend to form these assumptions without knowing as much as we should know. One assumption that unfortunately tends to get formed is that there's an attitude issue, that learners of English who are struggling are disrespectful, that they're lazy, that they're not interested, that they're being stubborn or defiant in some way. And whether or not a child is being defiant, making that be the focus of your intervention prevents you from having a successful intervention. It's also, unfortunately, very common to assume that when there's a language barrier, that means there's also a mental barrier, that there's a mental challenge or even an intellectual disability. And another really common misconception is the assumption that the child can't understand you just because they're not comfortable speaking in the language that you're speaking does not mean that they can't understand what you're saying. So you want to be really careful about that, especially if you're having a conversation about the child's skill level or challenges and barriers. As you move through this course, you'll be learning strategies for supporting English language development, and while some of the strategies are focused specifically on English language learners, a lot of them are applicable across a variety of different populations of children, not only just English language learners, but also kids with special learning needs or learning disabilities, and kids with emotional or behavioral issues or other barriers that are making it difficult for them to learn in your classrooms or in your programs. Some of the kind of core areas to make sure that you're thinking about. The first is to explore the skills that the child or children have across all different domains in order to be able to assess the strengths and the needs of the child globally rather than just kind of in one area. And that's something that you'll learn more about as we look at the WIDA standards. You'll also want to look at next steps for the development of the next relevant language skill in each domain. That's also something you'll find in the WIDA standards, which we'll look at soon. And then you also want to think broadly about learning styles. Think about all the different ways that children interact with and absorb information, and think about activities and learning experiences that speak to all of those different ways of taking in information and learning. And we'll be looking at UDL, or Universal Design for Learning, to help you think more clearly and more broadly about that. As you work through this course, and as you work with the kids in your program on English language development competencies, make sure that you work as hard as possible at being creative and holding creativity foremost in your mind. Your creativity and your exploration will be essential to the success of the activities that you plan. Make sure that you keep in mind that we're not only supporting English language development, but we're also supporting social emotional growth and development. So you want to provide opportunities for good decision making, for social interactions, for self-confidence and self-awareness, and so on. You also want to think about activities that are going to be engaging and exciting and relevant to the kids in your classroom. Not only relevant in terms of their interests, but also relevant in terms of their life experiences and backgrounds and cultural identities. You also want to think about the personalities and interest areas of the students and how you can fold those interest areas and personalities and skill sets into your activities to help the kids be really engaged. And keep an eye on your own energy. Think about the things that you like to teach, the things that are exciting for you to do with the kids, and try to make sure you're folding that in as much as possible. Because if you allow yourself to become bored or exhausted with the activities you're teaching, the kids are going to disengage as well. Finally, make sure that you find lots of ways to celebrate successes, because that keeps everybody excited and energized, and it also builds self-efficacy and self-esteem. Periodically throughout this course, we'll be asking you questions to check and see how your learning is going, and this is the first of those. Check all that apply. Which of the following are diversity factors that might be a part of a person's identity? Race, ethnicity, neighborhood they come from, mental health history, being raised by grandparents. So check any and all of those answers that are correct and then click the submit button.